It's the afternoon of May 31st, 1889. You're standing on the porch of your home in Johnstown, Pennsylvania, watching the rain come down in sheets. The Little Conemaugh River has been rising all day. It's already lapping at the doorsteps of the houses nearest the bank. You've seen floods before. This valley floods nearly every spring, but something feels different today. Neighbors are murmuring about the old dam up in the mountains, the South Fork Dam, 14 miles upstream. People have worried about that dam for years. Every time it rains hard, someone says the dam might break. It never does. You tell yourself it won't this time either. Then you hear it, a low, rolling roar, like thunder that doesn't stop. The ground beneath your feet begins to tremble. You look upstream, and where the river valley bends, the air itself seems to darken. A wall of debris, water, and mist is moving toward you at 40 miles per hour. You have maybe 2 minutes to live. Johnstown sat in a narrow river valley in the Allegheny Mountains of western Pennsylvania. By 1889, it was a thriving industrial city of roughly 30,000 people, built on the back of the Cambria Iron Company. Steelworkers, shopkeepers, immigrant families from Wales and Germany. They filled the crowded streets of a city hemmed in, on every side, by steep hills and converging rivers. The geography that made Johnstown productive also made it vulnerable. The city occupied a floodplain at the junction of the Little Conemaugh and Stony Creek rivers. When it rained heavily, the water had nowhere to go but through town. Residents had grown accustomed to occasional flooding. It was an inconvenience, not a catastrophe, but 14 miles upstream, at the top of the valley, sat something most Johnstown residents had never seen in person: an aging earthen dam holding back the largest artificial lake in America. And that dam belonged to some of the richest men in the country. The South Fork Dam had originally been built by the state of Pennsylvania in the 1850s as part of a canal and portage system. When the railroads made that system obsolete, the dam fell into disrepair. It was sold, neglected, and partially breached. By the 1870s, it was a crumbling relic. Then, in 1879, a group of Pittsburgh industrialists purchased the dam and the lake behind it. They called themselves the South Fork Fishing and Hunting Club. Their membership read like a roster of the Gilded Age elite: Andrew Carnegie, Henry Clay Frick, Andrew Mellon, and other titans of steel, coal, and banking. The club rebuilt the dam, but not well. They lowered its crest to make room for a road across the top. They removed the discharge pipes that had once allowed controlled release of water, and they installed fish screens across the spillway, which trapped debris and reduced its capacity. Engineers and downstream residents raised concerns. The club largely ignored them. On May 30th, 1889, a massive storm system stalled over western Pennsylvania. It was the remnant of weather that had already caused flooding across the central United States. Over the next 24 hours, between 6 and 10 inches of rain fell across the region, one of the heaviest rainfall events ever recorded in that area at the time. By early morning on May 31st, the rivers in Johnstown were already dangerously high. Water crept into basements, then first floors. Some residents moved upstairs. Others waded through flooded streets to higher ground, but most stayed put. They had ridden out floods before. Up at the South Fork Dam, the situation was far more dire. Lake Conemaugh had swollen to enormous size, and the water was rising toward the dam's crest. John Park, a young engineer at the club, rode on horseback to the nearby town of South Fork to telegraph a warning to Johnstown. But the warning was vague, and the telegraph lines were failing. Many who received it shrugged it off. They'd heard dam warnings before, Workers at the dam spent the morning desperately trying to save it. They attempted to dig an additional spillway. They tried to raise the dam's crest with earth and rock, but the rain was relentless and the lake was too full. At approximately 3:10 in the afternoon, on May 31st, the center of the South Fork Dam gave way. 20 million tons of water, the entire contents of Lake Conemaugh, poured through the breach in roughly 45 minutes. The lake, which had been 2 miles long and a mile wide, essentially emptied itself down the narrow valley toward Johnstown. The wall of water was initially about 60 feet high and half a mile wide. As it surged downstream, it gathered everything in its path: trees, boulders, houses, barns, rail cars, barbed wire from a factory upstream. It was no longer just water, it was a churning mass of debris moving at roughly 40 miles per hour, and it was heading straight for a city of 30,000 people. Before it reached Johnstown, the flood obliterated everything in its path. The small communities of South Fork, Mineral Point, and East Conemaugh were hit first. In Mineral Point, the wave was so powerful it stripped the earth down to bedrock. 16 people died there. The village was essentially erased. In East Conemaugh, the flood hit a rail yard where trains had been stopped by the rising water. Locomotive engineer John Hess had been blowing his whistle in warning as the wave approached. The flood picked up entire locomotives, weighing tens of tons each, and carried them downstream like toys. Hess was among the dead. At the village of Woodvale, just above Johnstown, the flood killed 314 people, roughly 1/3 of the population. The Gautier Wire Works was torn apart, and miles of barbed wire were released into the flood, tangling around victims and wrapping through the debris. It would become one of the most horrifying elements of the disaster. The flood reached Johnstown at approximately 4:07 in the afternoon. It had traveled 14 miles in under an hour. The wave, now a 35-foot-high wall of water, mud, and wreckage, slammed into the city with a force that witnesses compared to an explosion. Entire blocks of buildings were swept away in seconds. Some people were killed instantly. Others found themselves trapped in the upper floors of buildings that were being carried downstream, riding them like rafts until they broke apart. 16-year-old Victor Heiser watched from a hillside as his parents' house was torn from its foundation and swept away. He never saw them alive again. He survived by leaping from rooftop to rooftop. The entire disaster, from the moment the wave hit Johnstown to the moment the water began to settle, lasted roughly 10 minutes. In those 10 minutes, the geography of the city was rearranged. Where neighborhoods had stood, there was nothing but a mudscape of shattered timber and twisted metal. At the downstream end of Johnstown, the Pennsylvania Railroad's massive stone bridge acted like a net. The floodwaters drove an enormous pile of debris, houses, trees, rail cars, industrial wreckage, and human bodies, against the bridge's arches. The pile grew to cover roughly 30 acres and rose as high as 40 feet. Trapped within this wreckage were hundreds of people, some dead, many still alive, pinned and unable to free themselves. Then the debris caught fire. Overturned stoves, ruptured oil tanks, and scattered coals ignited the mass of splintered wood. The fire burned through the night. An estimated 80 people who had survived the flood itself were burned alive in the wreckage at the stone bridge. Survivors on the hillsides above could hear their screams but could do nothing to help. It was, by many accounts, the most harrowing chapter of the entire disaster. When dawn broke on June 1st, the scale of the catastrophe became visible. Johnstown was unrecognizable. Where a city had stood the day before, there was a wasteland of mud, wreckage, and stagnant water. Bodies were everywhere, tangled in wire, buried under rubble, wedged into the remains of buildings. The final death toll was 2,209 people. Entire families were wiped out. 99 entire families, in fact, were killed to the last member. 396 children under the age of 10 perished. 777 victims were never identified and were buried in a mass grave in Grandview Cemetery. News of the disaster spread across the country and the world within hours. The Johnstown Flood was the largest loss of civilian life in American history at that time. The response was immediate and unprecedented. Donations poured in from across the globe, totaling nearly $3.7 million, the equivalent of roughly $120 million today. 5 days after the flood, Clara Barton arrived in Johnstown with a team of 50 doctors and nurses. She was 67 years old and led the American Red Cross, which she had founded just 8 years earlier. Johnstown would become the organization's first major disaster relief operation on American soil. Barton stayed in Johnstown for 5 months, overseeing the construction of temporary housing, the distribution of supplies, and the care of the injured and orphaned. Her work there cemented the Red Cross's role as America's primary disaster relief organization, a role it holds to this day. Public fury quickly turned toward the South Fork Fishing and Hunting Club. Newspapers across the country blamed the wealthy club members for their negligent maintenance of the dam. The New York World wrote that the flood was not an act of God, but an act of criminal negligence. The people of Johnstown had died, the papers argued, because rich men had wanted a fishing lake. Lawsuits were filed, investigations were launched, but in the legal framework of the 1880s, the club members were effectively untouchable. The club itself had no significant assets. The dam and lake were gone. Individual members, including Carnegie and Frick, were shielded by the corporate structure of the club. No member was ever held legally liable. No one paid a single dollar in damages. Carnegie donated generously to the rebuilding effort, but quietly and through intermediaries. Frick said almost nothing publicly about the disaster for the rest of his life. The club itself quietly dissolved. The legal outcome, or lack of one, stunned many Americans and fueled growing anger at the unchecked power of Gilded Age wealth. Johnstown rebuilt. Within 5 years, the city had largely recovered, and the Cambria Iron Company resumed full operations. But the valley would flood again, devastatingly in 1936 and again in 1977. A reminder that geography is destiny, and that the lessons of disaster are not always learned the first time. The Johnstown flood became a turning point in American attitudes toward corporate responsibility and infrastructure safety. It helped fuel the progressive era reforms that followed. The idea that wealth carried obligation, and that negligence by the powerful was not simply misfortune for the powerless, it was injustice. Today, the Johnstown Flood National Memorial stands at the site of the South Fork Dam. The breach is still visible, a great scar in the hillside where the earth gave way. Below it, the lake bed is an empty meadow, quiet and green. It looks peaceful now. But 2,209 names are carved into the record, and every one of them is a reminder. A reminder that infrastructure is not just engineering, it is a promise. A promise that the people who build the dam and the people who live below it share the same interest in its integrity. When that promise is broken, by negligence, by greed, by indifference, it is always the people at the bottom of the valley who pay the price.